Hello, Russell here. When Reading Family Church, RFC, had to abandon plans for purchasing the building in Basingstoke Road, I began to reflect on some things that God has impacted me with, and began to see a pattern, and I'd like to try and share that with you. There are four things that I want to share, and I need to really tell the whole story. There are 4 pointers to what I think God seems to be prioritising for his church. The first goes back some years, over 20 years ago, when I was working with church pastors, seeking to bring them together to pray, and that eventually became the Reading Christian Network, RCN. And I was reading Judges chapter 6, the story of Gideon. I'm sure it'll be familiar to you. In that chapter, the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon and says, "Mighty man of valour, kick out the Midianites." And Gideon's response is basically, "You must be joking. We've heard the stories, we know about how God delivered the nation out of Egypt, but where is he now? What's happened to him? And we seem to be in such a mess." And so, as you read on in the story, you find that Gideon's father has an altar to Baal and an Asherah symbol, which is a fertility symbol. And Gideon has walked past this altar pretty well every day of his life, I'd imagine. And yet he makes no connection between those items and the breaking of the covenant, which so has offended God and caused them to be in such a political and economic mess. It was right before his eyes, but he made no connection with the present situation. And when I saw that, I simply prayed. I said, "Lord, is there something that's right before our eyes that's stark raving obvious to us, but we don't connect it to the powerlessness in the church today? And why are we so ineffective?" And as soon as I prayed that, it was as if the Lord took me in a helicopter above Reading, showed me like a map of Reading, and particularly pointed out the church buildings in Reading. You know, there is particularly the 2 spires, St Giles's Church, and there's Christ Church. Oh, and there's TFC when there was TFC, and there's Carey Baptist, and there's Brookside, and all these church buildings. And when I reflected on that for a while, I realised that this is the message we convey to the world, that our buildings mean a lot to us. They convey, first of all, a message of disunity, because we're separated, and we convey to everybody around that to hear the message, you've got to come into our building. Don't go into the building round the corner because, well, actually we're competing with them. And that makes us so ineffective. And at the time I thought, well, that's how things are. I can't do anything about it. You know, who am I? So that's just what you have to live with. And that was over 20 years ago. The second pointer, more recently, is in 2014. We were in Greyfriars Church. It was 1st of March. It was a church weekend. And the speaker was John Hughes, father of Tim Hughes. And before his second session, he pointed to Brig and me, and he said, I won't read the whole word that he gave. He gave a prophetic word, the only prophetic word I ever heard in Greyfriars Church. He said, "There's a couple in the second row there." He looked at us, and he felt that I just had a sense that you're a father in the church, that the word of God dwells deeply in you. It's been the touchstone of your life. There's a lot of treasure that you've mined over the years, both of you, in your walk with the Lord. And it's something, this is the point, it's something to pass on, and I think particularly to young leaders. I feel that people who've journeyed with the Lord for many years, they need to deposit what they've learned in the lives of young leaders. And it was really a message for Greyfriars as a church to invest in young leaders and to train them. And it was also personal to us, and we were kind of impacted by that. And we were there in Greyfriars. the vicar, Jonathan Wilmot, left soon afterwards, and then soon after he left, Dan Hayward, the curate, he left. He made us leaders of a group of home groups, but our involvement mainly was with the 20s and 30s for the interregnum period. And then the new vicar, David Walker, a great man of God, whom we loved to bits, he took over the job, and then we didn't do anything else. I was involved with mentoring a couple of guys and valued that, and that was all. And now we're no longer in Greyfriars. So that was something of the why, and the third item was something of the how. I watched a video of two American pastors describing what they do in their church, and they call it life on life missional discipleship. And they were talking to church leaders, and they were describing what they do in their church, and each of their leaders will pray and invite about 3, 4, maybe 5 young men or women if it's a woman, and say, will you join my discipling group? And over 18 months, a year perhaps, or whatever the period is, I will teach you all I know, I'll speak into your life, and the intention is at the end of that period, then you'll seriously consider inviting others, a group of 3 or 4, and do the same with them. So it's a clear agreement at the beginning that there's going to be a discipling group. And during the talk, one of those pastors, he said, let's have a brainstorm session. Describe what a spiritually minded, a mature Christian looks like. Let's have a brainstorm session. Tell me what they look like. Okay, so he wrote it on the flip chart. He reads the Bible regularly, prays regularly, is loving, is kind, and so we had fruits of the Spirit listed, and he knows his gifting and is happy in his gifting, and so on. And so that was, call it list A, what a mature Christian would look like. And we all should know someone at least who would inspire us in that way. And then also in the talk, he said, now, I'm addressing church leaders here. What does your church do really well? What do you like about what your church does well? Tell me. And I'll call this list B. So on his flip chart, he turned over the page and a new list. He put, well, I know you're all preachers, so there'll be preaching and teaching at the top of the list. So he wrote that down. And some said, well, we have a great worship band, and have several worship bands, some churches. And then we have youth work, and we have children's work, and we have outreach. We make sure our services are very seeker-friendly, and we invite unbelievers in and gear it towards them, and so on. All the things that the church does. Fine. And then came the crunch question. Does a lot of this in list B produce people like in list A? Does a lot of list B produce mature spiritual disciples of Jesus? And when we think of it, the church invests 80, maybe 90% or more of its time, resources and energy and money in the activities of list B. But how successful are we at producing mature Christians, disciples of Christ? And that made me really stop and think. I realised that was a significant question to ask about what we do in church. The Great Commission is to make disciples, and Jesus said, you baptize them and you teach them to obey, to keep, to guard, literally, all that I have commanded you. And are we discipling people? And one of the key phrases they had in that talk was think big, start small, go deep. And somebody asked them, do you have home groups in your church? Oh, yes, 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 of course. And that they serve a very useful purpose. People belong, they have a sense of belonging if they join a home group, and they want to get to know people, and that's fine. But they're not discipling groups. And the discipling groups are intentional, and the agreement is right there at the beginning that this is going to be a discipling group. So that was pointer number 3, which lodged deeply with me. Pointer number 4 was last year when I read a book by an Indian pastor called Victor John. It was called Bhojpuri Breakthrough. The Bhojpuri are a people group in North India with their own language, their own culture, in the states of, mostly in the states of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And he was a pastor there for about 15 years. Now that part of India, North India, is called the graveyard of missions. The Ganges flows through it, and so Hinduism is very strong. Buddha had his enlightenment experience there, and so Buddhism is very strong. Deoband is there, a city from which a lot of Islamist literature goes out around the world. So Islam is strong. But Christianity has faltered there for decades, probably centuries. Missionaries have been there, set up their stall, they've done this, that and the other usual stuff, but ineffective. And Victor John gave up, and he went away. And after 2 years, he came back with a different paradigm, a different emphasis. God must have met with him in some way. And he decided to emphasize, basically to do things Jesus' way, to disciple men and women, but he focused on men, and to teach them to obey what Jesus taught. And it might sound simple, but people said, oh, it won't work. But what has happened in the 15 years since then, they have seen something like 100,000 worshipping communities established in that part of North India. They don't count the number of believers. It's probably 10, 12 million. And this is in North India, one of the toughest places, really. And God has blessed what they've been doing. I'll just read a brief bit from his book, Victor John's book. We train people to discover God's will in his word and to obey his will as they discover it. This means both individually and as a movement we follow the Bible and the Spirit rather than church tradition. We don't do what's always been done, which produce little or no results. We let go of traditional patterns when they get in the way of God's purposes, as described in the Bible. They don't have church buildings. They say church buildings attract persecution. Although they're ready for persecution, they do get it at times. They don't want to attract it. They meet in village halls. They set up community learning centres, CLCs, get involved in the communities, the villages, and they have been very effective. And they share the gospel. And I found it stunning to read, and this is only in the last 15 or so years that this has happened. And the same thing is happening in Iran. The fastest growing church in the world is the underground church of Iran, and they have no buildings. Similar thing has been happening in China for decades. In fact, the buildings cause the problems. They emphasize discipling and obeying the Bible. And when I began to reflect on these things, I began to see God seems to be wanting us to change the way we invest our time and resources. We invested such a lot in buildings and meetings very often, so the church in general, in the West. And yet God seemed to be saying, you need to invest in discipling people. That is my commission to you. That's my task. And instead of investing so much of our time and resources in meetings, we need to say, are we discipling people? Do they know they are being discipled? Can they pass it on, as 2 Timothy 2:2 says? So I was more than delighted when the RFC set up the threes, and I realised, well, this is a significant step in the right direction. That's great. I'm not so sure whether individuals know what the discipling process is yet, but that can come perhaps. And I don't have a blueprint for how this might happen. That's up to the leadership of the church. But I feel that God is saying his priority for us is to invest in people, to see mature disciples of Christ. And it's done as Jesus did it with the 12, and he invested in 3 particularly, with the small groups, and to stress obedience to his word, and then being able to transmit that to other people. That's something what I feel God's been emphasising to me, and I just felt I had to share it with you. Do come back to me. I'd love to chat some more about it all. Thanks for listening.